The sky over northern France in May 1944 didn't smell like spring. It smelled of scorched hydraulic fluid and the stinging, chemical stench of 100-octane aviation fuel. Captain Karl-Heinz Weber felt the heat radiating through his lined flight boots before the first warning lamp on the instrument panel of his Messerschmitt Bf 109G6 even flickered to life. A fleeting glance over his right shoulder confirmed his worst nightmare. A thin, greedy tongue of orange flame was licking out from the engine cowling, already gnawing through the aluminum skin of the fuselage. Seconds earlier, he had been the hunter, tailing a formation of B-24 Liberators. Now, he was the victim of an unseen escort. A dull thud had rocked the airframe, followed by the hideous screech of metal on metal. Engine coolant sprayed against the windscreen, instantly crusting into an opaque, chalky film that robbed him of his vision. Weber yanked the stick into a steep left bank, desperate to starve the fire of oxygen, but the flames had already found their way into the cockpit's belly. The heat became unbearable. The plexiglass of the canopy began to warp and ripple, and the thick, oily black smoke from burning magnesium lines filled his lungs. He knew he had mere seconds before the main fuel tank, positioned directly behind his seat, would erupt. At 13,000 feet, there were no alternatives. He reached for the emergency canopy release. A loud crack, a violent suction of air, and suddenly the roaring slipstream was louder than the dying Daimler-Benz engine. Weber fumbled with his seat harness buckles, his fingers scorched by the metal. Centrifugal force tried to pin him into the seat as the burning Messerschmitt began to kick into a sickening, flat spin. With a final, desperate heave, he pushed off from the control stick and rolled over the side of the cockpit rail into the abyss. For one fleeting second, there was only the absolute, eerie silence of freefall, the tumbling sensation between the brilliant blue of the sky and the green patchwork of the French forests rushing up to meet him. He reached for the D-ring on his chest, bracing his body for the violent jerk of the silk canopy that would save his life. But as his fingers grasped at nothing but air, the adrenaline turned into pure, cold terror. He looked down at his own torso. Instead of the heavy, reassuring weight of the parachute pack, he saw only the bare, dangling straps of his harness hanging uselessly over his flight suit. In the frantic rush of the scramble or through some fatal oversight by the ground crew, the most vital piece of his equipment had never been hooked into the clips. He was falling at 120 miles per hour toward the earth, and he was wearing nothing but his uniform. The wind was a physical weight, a roaring, invisible river that threatened to tear the flight suit from Weber's skin. As he tumbled through the thin air at 10,000 feet, the realization of the missing pack hit him harder than any flak burst. His hands clawed instinctively at his hips, then his chest, searching for the heavy canvas bundle that should have been his lifeline. There was nothing. Just the rhythmic flapping of the harness straps against his thighs, mocking him with every rotation of his body. In the cold clarity of a man who knows he is about to die, Weber's mind raced back to the scramble at the airfield only 20 minutes earlier. The sirens had been a persistent, wailing shriek as the American heavies were sighted on radar. He remembered the chaos on the tarmac, the ground crews sprinting between the Me-109s, the smell of scorched rubber, and the frantic hand signals. His regular mechanic, Hans, had been out with a fever. In his place was a new man, a conscript from the Eastern Territories whose eyes had been wide with a hollow, unfocused fear. Had the boy simply forgotten to clip the seat pack parachute into the harness? Or was it something more sinister? Rumors of slow sabotage had been rippling through the Luftwaffe bases for months. Workers from occupied lands intentionally loosening a bolt, fraying a wire, or, in the ultimate act of silent execution, leaving a pilot to jump into a void with nothing but a prayer. Weber recalled the way the boy had avoided eye contact as he helped him into the cockpit. The memory felt like a cold stone in his stomach. Whether it was the lethal incompetence of a crumbling war machine or a deliberate act of vengeance by a forced laborer, the result was the same. Weber was a dead man falling through a beautiful, indifferent sky. The fear peaked and then, strangely, began to plateau into a cold, analytical detachment. He was falling at terminal velocity, his body a chaotic, flailing shape against the blue. He looked down. The French countryside was no longer a distant map. It was a rapidly expanding reality of hedgerows, stone walls, and the dark, bristling canopy of a pine forest. He had roughly 60 seconds of life remaining. He looked at his hands, scorched, grease-stained, and shaking. He was a pilot. His entire life was defined by the struggle to control uncooperative machinery. He refused to simply wait for the impact. He began to experiment with his body position, arching his back and spreading his limbs to catch more air, trying to slow the inevitable. His mind searched for any scrap of drag, any object he could use to fight the gravity that was pulling him toward his grave. It was then that he felt the hard, rectangular pressure against his lower back, something that had snagged on his harness as he rolled out of the burning cockpit. It wasn't a parachute, but it was mass. It was a chance. The object digging into the small of Weber's back was a miracle born of mechanical failure. As he had rolled out of the tilting Messerschmitt, the jagged edge of the canopy frame had snagged the heavy, rubberized horsehair seat cushion, the Sitzkissen, and dragged it out with him. It was now wedged firmly between his lower back and the tangled webbing of his parachute harness. It was less than 2 inches thick and barely 18 inches square, a pathetic shield against a 4,000-meter drop, but to a dying man, it was a sail. With the roar of the wind deafening him, Weber reached behind his hips. His fingers, stiff with cold and adrenaline, clawed at the cushion. He fought the slipstream, which tried to rip his arms from their sockets, until he finally wrenched the pad free. For a terrifying second, the change in his aerodynamics sent him into a violent, stomach-churning tumble. The sky and the earth traded places in a sickening strobe effect, blue, green, blue, brown, until he managed to flatten his body out, clutching the cushion to his chest like a lover. He knew the physics were against him. Terminal velocity for a human in a spread eagle position is roughly 120 miles per hour. To survive, he needed to drag that number down, to create even a fraction of the resistance a real parachute would provide. He thrust the cushion upward, holding it above his head with both hands, tilting it slightly to catch the rushing air. The jerk was instantaneous. It wasn't the bone-snapping deployment of silk he had prayed for, but it was a distinct, heavy pressure against his shoulders. The cushion vibrated with such violence that he feared his wrists would snap, but he held on, his teeth bared in a silent predatory snarl against the wind. He began to use the pad like a rudimentary wing. By angling the stiff, rubberized material, he found he could slide across the air, steering his fall. He wasn't just a falling stone anymore. He was a very poor glider. He looked down through squinted, watering eyes. Below him, the patchwork of Normandy was rushing up with predatory speed. He could see the individual stone walls of the farms and the white ribbons of the dirt roads. He saw a cluster of buildings, a village, and veered away, desperate to avoid the hard, unforgiving slate of a roof or the stone of a town square. His eyes locked onto a dark, smudge-like expanse to the east, the Forêt de Lalande, a dense, ancient stand of pine and spruce. In the cold logic of survival, the trees were his only hope. They were spears, yes, but they were also springs. If he could hit the canopy at the right angle, the brittle branches might snap one by one, bleeding off his kinetic energy before he hit the forest floor. He gripped the cushion tighter, his knuckles white, and steered himself toward the green sea. He was no longer a pilot of a Messerschmitt. He was the pilot of a seat cushion, navigating the final seconds of his life. The green carpet of the Forêt de Lalande was no longer a distant texture. It was a jagged, hungry sea of pine needles and timber rushing upward at a terrifying velocity. Weber had less than 10 seconds of air left. In the cockpit of his Messerschmitt, he was a master of energy management, trading altitude for airspeed, turn rate for position. Now, his only currency was his own body mass, and the exchange rate was lethal. He shifted his grip on the rubberized seat cushion, tilting it hard to the left to slip the air, steering his plummet toward a particularly dense cluster of ancient spruce. He wasn't looking for a soft spot. There were no soft spots at 120 miles per hour. He was looking for a ladder. He needed a tree with deep, layered boughs that could act as a series of progressive breaks, snapping one by one to bleed off the kinetic energy that threatened to liquefy his bones upon impact with the granite-hard forest floor. Not the trunk, he hissed through gritted teeth, the wind tearing the words from his lips. Hit the brush. Hit the green. He pulled his knees toward his chest and crossed his ankles, a primitive version of the parachute landing fall he'd been taught in flight school, but without the silk to stabilize him. He tucked his chin into his collar to protect his jugular from snapping branches and clutched the seat cushion over his face and chest like a Spartan shield. It was a pathetic defense, but it was the only thing between his vitals and the splintering wood. The transition from the roar of the open sky to the chaos of the canopy was instantaneous. The first contact was a sickening, high-pitched crack, the sound of a topmost pine leader snapping like a toothpick. Then came the strobe light effect of green and brown as he smashed through the upper layer of the forest. The cushion was ripped from his hands almost immediately, vanishing into the debris, but it had done its job. It had taken the initial, bone-shattering brunt of the first 3 branches. Now, he was a human pinball. Crack. Snap. Thud. Every limb that broke against his body felt like a hammer blow. A thick branch caught him in the ribs, spinning him horizontally. Another lashed across his thighs, shredding his flight suit and the skin beneath. He could hear his own grunts of pain over the splintering wood, a rhythmic, guttural sound that matched every impact. The world was a blur of needles, sap, and the terrifying vertical descent toward the dark forest floor. He felt a massive branch, the primary limb of an old-growth spruce, catch him under the armpits. It didn't snap immediately. For a fraction of a second, it bent, bowing under his weight, slowing his velocity to a fraction of what it had been in the open sky. Then, with a sound like a pistol shot, it gave way. Weber plummeted the final 15 feet, crashing through a dense thicket of younger saplings before finally slamming into a deep, mossy depression between 2 protruding roots. Silence rushed back into the woods, broken only by the distant, receding hum of the Allied bomber stream high above and the soft, rhythmic pat-pat of falling pine needles settling onto his broken body. He lay perfectly still, his eyes squeezed shut, waiting for the darkness to take him. But the darkness didn't come. Instead, there was the sharp, stinging scent of pine resin and the incredible, impossible sensation of air moving in and out of his lungs. The silence of the Forêt de la Lande was absolute, a heavy shroud that seemed to press against Weber's eardrums. For a long, disconnected minute, he wasn't sure if he was alive or if this was the quiet foyer of the afterlife. Then, the pain arrived. It didn't come as a single wave, but as a series of electric shocks, radiating from his extremities toward the center of his chest. His first conscious act was a gasp, a jagged, shallow intake of air that felt like swallowing broken glass. He lay in a cradle of ferns and rotted pine needles, his body twisted at an angle that defied the natural alignment of a human frame. He didn't move. He couldn't. He performed a mental pre-flight check of his own limbs, a habit born of years in the cockpit. His left leg was a dull, throbbing weight, pinned beneath a fallen branch the size of a fence post. He could feel the wet heat of blood soaking through his flight suit, a compound fracture of the tibia, he guessed, based on the unnatural protrusion against the fabric. His right arm was tucked awkwardly beneath his torso, the shoulder screaming with the fire of a clean dislocation. But he was breathing. Every rib on his left side felt like it had been struck by a sledgehammer, and his vision was swimming in a sea of gray and red pinpricks, but the rhythmic expansion of his lungs was a miracle he couldn't quite comprehend. He had fallen from 13,000 feet without a parachute, and yet, the earth had failed to claim him. The ladder of spruce branches had done the impossible. They had traded their own structural integrity for his life, snapping one by one to bleed away the lethal kinetic energy of his descent. Weber spit a mouthful of copper-tasting blood into the moss. He looked up. High above, through the jagged hole he had punched into the forest canopy, the sky was a brilliant, indifferent blue. He could still hear the faint, ghostly drone of the B-24s, now far to the east, their silver wings glinting like minnows in a stream. They were returning to England, to hot coffee and debriefings. He was 1,000 miles from home, broken in the dirt of a country that wanted him dead. He tried to shift his weight, and a white-hot spike of agony shot through his pelvis, forcing a strangled cry from his throat. He realized then that he couldn't stay here. The smoke from his crashed Messerschmitt would already be a black finger pointing toward this sector of the woods. German search parties, or worse, French Maquis partisans would be converging on the crash site. In his current state, he was a trophy for the former and a target for the latter. He reached out with his functional left hand, his fingers clawing into the damp, fragrant earth. He had to move. He had to find a way to stabilize his leg and hide before the hunters arrived. The adrenaline that had seen him through the fall was beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, bone-deep shuddering. He was alive, yes, but in the predatory quiet of the French woods, alive was a temporary condition that he would have to fight for with every inch of his shattered body. The transition from surviving the fall to surviving the forest was a slow, agonizing crawl through the muck of the French underground. Weber knew the clock was ticking. The pillar of black smoke from his downed Bf 109 was a beacon for every German search party and French Maquis cell within 20 miles. He was a broken prize in a high-stakes hunt. With his right shoulder dislocated and his left leg a mangled ruin of bone and flight suit, he couldn't walk. He couldn't even stand. He had to become a creature of the forest floor. His first task was stabilization. Using the heavy, serrated survival knife from his boot, Weber cut away the blood-soaked fabric of his trouser leg. The sight of the white bone protruding through the skin was enough to make his vision swim in a sea of gray, but he forced himself to stay conscious. He hacked 2 sturdy branches from a nearby sapling and, using the silk-like shroud lines from his useless harness, lashed his leg into a crude, rigid splint. The pain was a blinding white light behind his eyes, a rhythmic screaming in his nerves that he had to box away in a corner of his mind. Then, the movement began. Weber rolled onto his stomach, his functional left arm reaching forward to claw into the damp earth and rot. He dragged himself inch by inch, his breath coming in ragged, wet hitches. Every foot of progress was a battle against the friction of the forest floor. Pine needles scratched his face. Hidden roots snagged his splintered leg, sending fresh jolts of agony through his pelvis. He wasn't moving like a man. He was moving like a wounded predator, seeking the darkest, deepest thicket where he could disappear. By dusk, he had reached a limestone hollow beneath a fallen oak, nearly 300 yards from his initial impact site. He pulled a layer of dead ferns over his body, the scent of damp earth and decay filling his nostrils. The cold was beginning to set in, the aftershock that kills more pilots than the crash itself. His body shook with a violent, uncontrollable tremor as his core temperature plummeted. He reached into his pocket and found a single, crushed bar of Coca-Cola, the caffeine-infused chocolate issued to Luftwaffe crews. He forced a piece between his chattering teeth, the bitter sweetness a fleeting reminder of the world he had left behind in the clouds. In the distance, the first sounds of the hunt arrived. The sharp, rhythmic barking of German shepherds and the occasional, muffled shout in his native tongue. They were close, but they were searching the crash site, looking for a body in the charred remains of a cockpit. They wouldn't expect a man with a shattered frame to have dragged himself this far. Weber closed his eyes, his hand gripping the hilt of his knife. He had cheated gravity, survived the ladder of the trees, and out-crawled the Reaper. He was a pilot who had lost his plane, his parachute, and his mobility, but as the first stars began to pierce the canopy above, he realized he had kept the only thing that mattered, his life.